So I don't know how many of you are familiar with WIP and what I do, but I started a developer relations practice 15 years ago. And what we did was, there was a couple of things. We did a lot of workshops with clients to help them understand what developer relations is, get them set up with their own programs, and support a lot of what they did. But I was certainly finding with going to a lot of conferences and talking with other peers, that seems like there was kind of a lot of reinvention of the wheel. Or every time I'd go to a DevRel conference, people were always talking about, well, what is DevRel? It's like, we already know what it is. I think somebody needs to like put it down on paper going, this is what it is, and let's move forward, as opposed to all this navel gazing that we do all the time. So I had a couple of conversations with some folks saying, I've got all this stuff that I use. I'm just going to throw it out online and open source it and let everybody just sort of use it, because I've got a lot of frameworks that I've been using very successfully over the years. And then when I started to look through all my PowerPoint slides, it's like, it's not as well written as would be really helpful to a lot of people. So I had a conversation with James last year when I was in the UK, going like, I'm starting to write this book because I just want to put all this stuff in one place, and would love to work with you on it, because, I come at it from, a different kind of community building, and also from a consulting perspective. And, James has been at it from in the field. Probably would be, would you be interested in teaming up with me, and then also working with the larger community base, just to make sure that we had some checks and balances on some of the things that we were thinking about. So much to my delight, James said, yes, count me in. And I think every now and again he shakes his head going, oh my goodness, this is like a bigger task than we thought it would be. But I'll let him comment on that part of it. And I'm based in Vancouver, Canada, just so you know.
Yeah, so I'm in the UK, as you probably guessed from my accent. I sound very much like the other James on the call. James and I have known each other, I guess, oh God, at least 10 years, I guess, James. So we worked together when I was at Telefonica, I think.
Yeah, I think that may be more than 10 years, but we'll call it 10 years.
Yeah, it makes us seem younger. So we'll go with that. So just to give you a kind of flavor of who I am, because you probably have never heard of me before. I started DevRel. Well, I kind of got a mobile industry background, like Caroline mentioned. I used to do product management and product innovation inside O2 in the UK, and then for Telefonica, who are the kind of global corporate owner of O2. And I kind of, around about early 2000, I came to the conclusion that telcos cannot deliver products. So we really should stop trying to do that. And what we should really do is concentrate on opening up our infrastructure and make our assets available to developers so they can innovate on top of our network and stop wasting all this time and money for the telcos trying to always exert their control on it, all the user experiences. I kind of got enough traction inside the carrier to hang myself. So I got enough money to kind of do 2 programs. I did a thing called O2 Litmus in the UK in the kind of early 2000s. And then I moved on and did a thing called Blue Via at Telefonica, which was their second attempt at a kind of developer program. Thankfully, my knights in shining armor appeared on the horizon, and I got headhunted by Twilio to set up their European business. So I joined Twilio as the first person outside the US in 2012, and I ran their European business for 5 years or so until the IPO. And then that's kind of where Carol and I came back together, because I was kind of thinking about what I do next. I'm kind of running a startup hub in Cambridge in the UK, working with Cambridge University as kind of my day job. But then I'm also now obviously helping Caroline get this book underway and trying to, as she says, commit a lot of these kind of experiences, frameworks, processes, best practice to paper. And even though the title sounds a tad pretentious, we're not claiming we know everything. We're not claiming that this is going to be the Bible for DevRel. It's very much about getting everyone's perspective as much as we possibly can, and just trying to help move things forward as a community, rather than us to, you know, lording it around, pretending we're the gurus. That's not the intention at all. Just to reassure everyone.
Yeah, and I should add too, I think we very much want to make it a Creative Commons. So, you know, use the frameworks, use the tools, and let's make them better. You know, and the reason why other practices do better is because there are a lot of common frameworks to use. You obviously tweak them for what you need to do, but that's what helps grows practices and grows professional organization. You know, professional practices.
Yeah, so really, we got some slides which we can throw up in a second, but the idea is to make this hopefully a bit interactive rather than just try and sell you a book, because that's not the objective. So we just want to kind of test out a few of the kind of baseline assumptions that we're working to on the book, which you may have seen if you've taken a look at the questionnaire already. But, you know, we just want to have an interactive conversation and just get a temperature check of where you guys are at, and if you think this is needed, or if actually you think the community is doing a great job and potentially this kind of thing isn't needed. You know, all feedback is welcome.
Is this where we can chime in, or?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, when I took the quiz or the survey just before hopped on the call, and one thing that struck me is, I mean, DevRel is this huge spectrum, right? And so, like, the idea of that you could, you know, present something that was useful to me, where I'm like the only DevRel person at a 6-person startup, that would also be useful to somebody at like Vonage or O2. I'm just not sure that that's possible. And so that's one thing I wanted to kind of, you know, have you guys thought about like targeting in on, you know, DevRel teams or something like that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And in fact, you know, and we'll be completely transparent with you. This is one of our biggest challenges in trying to write the book and get this committed to paper, is really focusing on the audience for the book, because, as you say, number one, it's a really complex topic with a very large surface area, but number two, we're trying to, and maybe we're being too ambitious to try and get it all in one book, but we're trying to appeal to a number of different potential readers. You know, on one hand, you've got the kind of business owner, stakeholder that might be sponsoring a program inside a corporation or an organization, and trying to help them understand what DevRel is and why it's important. You know, we've got the people that are running programs and helping equip them with the processes and the tools. We've got people that might aspire to move into DevRel, like, you know, college students or people looking for career changes and trying to get them inspired and excited. So yeah, I mean, it's going to be hugely challenging to do this well, and you know, we're going to definitely need some support of a good editor to help us pull all of this kind of stuff together.
I want to add too, though, and you know, in my 15 years of consulting in this industry, I've worked with startups, and actually I'm fractional lead DevRel in a 20-person machine learning startup right now, and I'm also working with, you know, companies like Qualcomm, and so I've worked in, you know, sort of inside or with teams of all sizes, and a lot of the frameworks that I use, I'm definitely able to use with all of them. And I think some of the new frameworks that we've come up with help to better understand just how to position developer relations, no matter what size of team you're in, what size of company you're in, and also depending on where DevRel sits, because as we know, there is sort of no one place where it tends to sit. And so to having, I think, that broader understanding is helpful. And I think what I've seen through all of the different organizations that I've worked with, it tends to come down to the real value around developer relations. I often get off, you know, I'm either getting asked by executives, you know, I need to sell this to my execs, or I need to sell this to my board. How do I make them understand what developer relations is and what the value is? You know, or we're starting something new, you know, within a company, and we need to realign the teams, or even with the startup that I'm working with, you know, they start building a product, and it's very important to me when I'm instilling in them in the beginning this culture of how important developer relations is to everything that they do. So, yeah. I think what where we struggle with the book is we definitely want to start on the high level, what it is and why it's important. Partly we've been drilling down into like, here are all the details about developer experience and how you put office hours together. And that's probably too detailed, at that point, when we need to that's maybe overwritten and we need to, I think maybe that's book 2. Maybe. But I definitely hear what you're saying. It's broad. It's broad, and we recognize that.
Yeah, and another thought that just pops into my head is like, I think if we're successful, we need to kind of paint the picture of, as you kind of progress through the stages of a company, kind of signpost the tactics and the strategies that are appropriate at that point in time. Because you're absolutely right. A one-person DevRel team isn't going to be doing the same thing as AWS right now, right? They're completely different things, obviously. But when we talk to our kind of consulting clients, the common questions are always, how am I doing? Where should I be heading? And can you benchmark me against what good looks like? So even though you might be really early in your journey, people still want an idea about where they're heading to, rather than just kind of driving into the dark. So I think if we can structure and format the book in a way that they can flick ahead and have a sense of where they're going without having the pressure of feeling like they're missing out on something, or they should be acting on some kind of recommendation before they're ready to do that, then hopefully it becomes useful.
Well, and just on that note, I mean, many of you are familiar with Slash-Data, and they come out with a lot of data that benchmarks based on developer sentiment, and they might tell you that, developers like this program more than others, and they like these docs better than another, but they never say how to make it better. There's not really some, the drill down on some more of the functional stuff. So how about those slides? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, I think one question for me is sort of a bit of a Flyless question, given I'm seeing a bit of a change in the conversation, certainly about sort of validating the value of the work you do, because DevRel this year has created all sorts of challenges, and some of the expectations about what DevRel was doing and so on. I mean, I'm not saying you should put that in the book, but I am interested. Are you hearing different conversations? Because certainly with a lot of my clients, I am getting this sort of, we know that we need to do DevRel a bit differently because we're not traveling, but to your point about best practices, what should we do therefore?
Say that again. What was the question?
DevRel, if you look at, okay, so your job is to go and do a bunch of meetups, right? Your job is to go and we're going to measure that accordingly. We've seen companies that are much more skeptical because they're like, well, we don't know how to invest in DevRel because the role seems to be changing because nobody can travel. So that's something I've had that conversation multiple times. Maybe you're not experiencing that.
Definitely seen some of that. I think less so. Many of the customers that we deal with have gone to a content strategy for the last few years, and we're starting to get off the events bandwagon anyways. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely a conversation. Yes, it's definitely a conversation to have, and but I think it's more at that evangelist level as opposed to some of the more strategic issues, I guess.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I think travel in particular, I think applies at the evangelism level, not necessarily as DevRel as a whole, because obviously there's many more components of DevRel that aren't contingent on travel. And I think also, I mean, I think Caroline touched on it, but I think it's worth just reiterating it. Another challenge we have with the book is pitching it between strategy and tactics, because I don't think we really want to get sucked into the low-level tactics. We want to be a little bit higher up towards strategy because, frankly, tactics will change every 6 months. So they're almost out of date the minute you publish the book. And I'm not sure the book can achieve, like if you've got you know, $200 to spend. Should you go to a meetup? Should you go on Twitch? Should you put a blog post out? You know, I don't think we'll solve that, and I don't think we want to solve that with a book. I think, you know, the book can never replace the community conversation that happens every day of the week, right? Which is going to be perfect for fine tuning those kind of tactics. I mean, I appreciate you haven't seen anything we've done, so it's kind of difficult to understand where we're pitching it. But we've got a couple of kind of models that that we'll show you in the slides in a second, which might help frame that a little bit better.
So I had a question. So who is, you know, you kind of touched on this with strategy versus tactics. Who is the book for? Is it for the sort of management structure that wants to build a DevRel practice and is trying to figure out how? Is it for a DevRel person? Which sort of persona or perspective do you kind of intend to target mostly?
I mean, right now we're actually targeting both with the book. That might be ambitious, and it might lead to some structural challenges in the book. But we feel like, number one, I've certainly encountered this in my career time and time again, and I'm sure James has, because, you know, his client base is some of the larger organizations in the space. And it's, you find that management or stakeholders in an organization have a passing understanding of DevRel and will give permission for people to experiment. But typically something else comes along which distracts them after maybe 18 months, 2 years, 24 months down the line. And we all know that the return on investment of DevRel activities takes time to nurture and develop, right? So a big part of the book is aimed at the stakeholder to better educate them around what DevRel is and why it's important and why it needs long-term engagement and support. But equally, we want to make sure these are implementable processes, frameworks, and tools to improve the practitioners' day-to-day impact on the organization. So it's as much for the practitioner it is for the, if you like, the business person or the stakeholder. You might be skeptical that we can pull that off, and I think both Carolyn and I are both concerned about that as well. So that's why we do need to think about the structure of the book and make sure it doesn't try to talk. It's like, you know, any marketing, right? If your website's trying to talk to 3-4 different people, it's going to appeal to no one, right? You have to be very specific with your messaging. So we have that same concern with the book, although we are being quite ambitious with it at the moment.
And we certainly don't want to get into the weeds in terms of a lot of the tactical stuff, like which meetups you should go to. And, you know, especially, I mean, in the way developer relations has blossomed in a good way, you know, I wouldn't recommend the same, you know, meetup to a machine learning startup that I would to, you know, sort of a Qualcomm, you know, somebody who's dealing with mobile VR headsets. Like that's so broad. But I think any good evangelist, even if they're a junior evangelist, to do their job well, should have a good understanding of developer relations from that strategic perspective, to do their job well, and also to think about career progression, right? Like they really need to, I think, should have a good understanding of how that works.
Yeah, what might be really useful for me at least would be like maybe a workbook companion or online resources that kind of go with the book, that way it kind of gives you some ways to work through everything that you need.
We definitely want to do that, and we're yeah, good idea. That's why we want to open source everything too, and just make it Creative Commons and like use the stuff and let's make it better, you know.
I was going to say, I think you've got like 3 books. There's sort of like the strategy of developer relations. There's the sort of internal structuring of how do you work this into your organization. Then there's like, how do you do it?
Yeah.
Just so we've all jumped in a bit before you presented anything. So should we do some slides, because we all seem to be highly opinionated today. Evidently, we're glad to be talking to humans about something that isn't politics.
Yeah, I was going to say, time
so
check.
true.
If we could jump into the slides now, that would be awesome. I am dying to hear. Hi, Caroline. Super excited to hear the content.
Yeah, there we go. So I'll shut up and let's go for it.
All right.
Okay. Shall I throw them up, Caroline?
Sure.
Right. Okay.
I appreciate everybody's enthusiasm, and yes, I think that's the great thing about DevRel. We do have lots of opinions. It's good. We're
And I
not
think it
usually a
shows
quiet
that you're
bunch.
hitting.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Well, and I think it shows that you're hitting something that's needed.
Thanks.
Can you see that?
Yep, looks great.
Yes.
Okay, cool. I'll skip through that. We've done the introduction, so I can skip through that too. I think you've seen the link to the questionnaire, and it's in the chat as well. So thank you for putting that in the chat box. Do you want to do this one, Caroline, first, or should I do this one?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, this is the first kind of. This is if you like, this is our foundational starting point for some of the challenges that we've certainly experienced. I certainly experienced most of these things in my career. So it's interesting to see if these resonate with you, you know, if you've seen them yourselves, and the questionnaire invites you to kind of, you know, stack rank them in terms of the priority for them. But, you know, number one, if you're starting out afresh, you know, how do we go about convincing our stakeholders we need to launch a DevRel program? Once we've got that kind of green light, how do we go about creating it? How do we market? You know, how do we make our developers aware of our offer? How do we differentiate ourselves? You know, how do we stand out from the crowd? Because, you know, as we all know, one of the byproducts of DevRel and developer tools exploding as they have over the last 10 years is there's so much noise in the market now. So how do you cut through that? How do you get your developers to use the products? How do we ensure developers are successful using the products? The old classic, you know, how do we measure success? And then, you know, how do we maintain the support of the stakeholders? Because as I kind of referenced earlier in the conversation, certainly at Telefonica, you know, I was successful achieving number 1 and number 2, but I wasn't successful at number 8 because within 2 years, the program was being questioned and ultimately got shut down. So just because you win over the stakeholders initially doesn't necessarily mean that you can maintain that, or how do you maintain that successfully over a number of years? Clearly, that's easier to do in a developer-centric organization, but when you're in an organization that isn't necessarily predominantly geared up to support developers, then that becomes quite challenging. I don't know if there's any thoughts on those, or if you prefer just to kind of answer them on the questionnaire.
I think given time, we probably need to just go through some of the other slides.
Okay, yeah, I'm getting a thumbs up. I'll move on. Next slide then. So, I mean, Caroline, you, I think, coined this term. So did you want to describe this one?
Sure. So some of you have probably filled out our surveys over the years of developer relations. And we were always trying to figure out how do we divide these companies up and what do they call them? And actually developer first is something that Twilio came up with. It's like, okay, that kind of makes sense. That's sticky. You know, those are the companies that have always had their primary business model is about developers. But then what about all the other companies? You know, the Apples, the Qualcomms, the banks that are opening up APIs. And we always called those developers second, and that didn't sound quite right. And so just in this last survey, I kind of thought about it a little bit, and Developer Plus just sounded like a better way to say it, where it wasn't necessarily a secondary thought, or at least we didn't want to position it as a secondary thought, but it's just how you know, having a developer program extends the model or supports the primary business model. So that's certainly something, you know, we've been using, but wanted to you know, sort of do a litmus test with everybody else. Does that make sense? You know, is that something that you guys can kind of rally behind as we explain what type of companies are part of developer relations?
And I think getting this right is critical, right? Because, I mean, I've worked both in developer plus organizations and developer first organizations, and the experience is completely different. You know, the lens that you see the world through is so different in a developer first company, where many of the answers to questions are obvious. Whereas in a developer plus company, you know, the majority of the organization doesn't understand developers, isn't motivated by the same objectives that you might be. And even the simplest things turn into a battle. So, you know, getting that kind of context in plays is kind of really interesting. And you see the impact of those differences in different survey data as well. Should I just keep going? Yeah.
Stop us if there's, yeah, you have any questions.
So yeah, I mean, this slide talks to exactly what I just said, actually. So, you know, DevRel leaders can lack credibility with certain stakeholders. And as I say, I put myself in this kind of bucket because I certainly did this at Telefonica. So there can be a disconnect with the overall company objectives. You know, we get very inward facing on the problems we're trying to solve and the audiences we're trying to serve, sometimes going in a slightly different direction to the overall company strategy, especially for developer plus companies. I think we would all identify as entrepreneurial, and we like to break the rules, break processes, which can cause friction inside kind of larger organizations. And like I say, we can operate inside bubbles, and we definitely speak a different language to mainstream marketers in particular. And as I said up top, you know, DevRel programs do need time to show return on investment, and that's actually quite alien to a lot of organizations. I remember very vividly being in a kind of stakeholder meeting at Telefonica, and James will probably appreciate this because, you know, he's worked with these kinds of companies a lot of times, where I'm sitting there kind of justifying. So my program called Bluvia was making 30 million euros a year. I think most of us would be pretty pleased with that for a developer program. But I actually remember sitting across the table with the guy that ran our post-pay marketing, so, you know, contract mobile phones, and he said, well, I could make that in about 3 hours by shaving a penny off SMS. You know, so just completely different metrics, different attitude, and a completely different context. There's no right or wrong in that kind of example. It just shows you that being inside an organization, you can't just assume everyone is on the same page, pulling to the same goals with the same strategy. And again, you know, I very much, DevRel people can be more networked outside the company because we spend so much of our time engaging the community. And actually, because there's so many hours in the day, and because they're kind of not our kind of people in quotes, we can underutilize networking inside the organization, which might not affect you on a day-to-day basis, but when you come into that meeting to justify your program and no one around that table knows you or knows why you're doing it, that becomes a major issue and actually could be fatal to your entire program. And then, as Caroline mentioned, you know, career progression. Is there a glass ceiling if you work inside DevRel? Do you have to move on to progress? You know, how do we create this as a professional practice? How do we give those career opportunities? How do we get the top seats at the table? Shall I, you can do the next one.
Next on thesis then. I'm unmuted. I just should mention too, open sources, you know, open source programs are something, again, a bit of a different animal, and there's a lot of the frameworks are similar, but we don't specifically address a lot of the different open source programs. So just wanted to add that in. But yet again, in testing our thesis, you know, what we've noticed is there's calls like this that are great. There's a number of Slack channels. There's you know, different conferences that are there, but they tend to be, you know, it's very peer training, right? There's no way that you can go for sort of a source. And you know, I found too, if you're looking for information, there's DevRel Earth just happened. There's a lot of great talks on there, but if you need to find a certain piece of it, it's just really hard to find that. So just lots of fragmented information and not always really consistent information about that. A lot of folks, you know, who are in their careers kind of move on. And so we're thinking, you know, whether it's, again, we're not going to make it the Bible, but definitely a reference text that people could use and that we could also, you know, as a group build on with frameworks and processes and tools that are repeatable. And I think repeatable is really an important part of that.
Okay, this is a slightly simplified diagram that might end up appearing in the book, although I haven't made a kind of decision on that, but it goes back to that earlier conversation around, you know, DevRel being a broad topic area. So we were trying to find a way to graphically illustrate both the areas that are covered by the term, but also how they interrelate. So to briefly kind of walk you through the diagram, and like I said, there's a lot more detail that was probably too much to share today, but the different kind of key components is obviously developer marketing, which is pretty self-explanatory. Developer experience in terms of the developers actually interactions with your products, your APIs, your documentation, etc. And then developer success, making sure actually people can build something meaningful with your tools and then celebrating that after the fact. And then the bit that kind of underpins it in the middle is developer relations, which really, if we're doing our jobs well, is interacting across all of these different areas and presenting themselves as that kind of information valve between the company and the developer audience, and bringing, having that bi-directional communication channel open and bringing insight and feedback back into the company and taking, news and development and kind of information back out to the developer community and supporting and nurturing them. And then really, as you can see, it's going in a kind of a stylized tree direction. And without the community, which is effectively your trunk, the tree can't survive, right? So you have to nurture that community and you have to feed that community and make sure its roots are deep and strong. Otherwise, the tree falls over. Anything to add on that, Caroline? Or?
I don't think so.
Okay. This is a lot to take in, so I'll leave it on screen for a second. But again, this is an attempt to try to map out the developer journey. I don't know if you want to talk through this, Caroline?
Yeah, and I don't know, on my screen, I'm finding it quite hard to read. I don't know how it's, how you guys are seeing it on your screen.
The resolution not good enough.
It might be.
Yeah, that does seem to be an issue with that.
Yeah, so I'm having a hard time reading all of the different pieces. We could share it with you in another format, because I would love to get some feedback on here.
Yeah, let's see if I can hack this fast enough, and I'll put it into the chat room or something like that, assuming I can attach an image.
Sure. Okay.
Oop, hang on.
Otherwise, if you stay on it, I can speak to it.
Okay, yeah, let's do that. That'll save time. Hang on. There we go.
So in terms of developer journey mapping, it's something that, again, we've done a lot of, where I'm sure many of you are familiar with journey mapping, but I've never found sort of a really good journey map. So we kind of worked on building this one in terms of the stages developers go through, from trying to discover your product to actually, building and scaling something. What are the questions that they ask, and what do you need to answer along that journey? And so we physically will go in and how do we actually find out about this particular, developer tool, whatever it is, API, SDK, and then, what's my journey as I go through it? And there's certainly are, friction logging is part of that, although that tends to be part of just the developer experience as opposed to the whole piece of it. And then what are all the pieces that are part of it that you need to think about? And so some of that will fall more into the developer marketing, your SEO, for instance, which is really important. And others fall into more that dev experience, product for sure, but your documentation, your FAQs, your getting started guide, your time to hello world, all of those different pieces. And so the documents itself, the developer experience is from the evaluate to some of the scale. And so when you see this in a clearer line, you'll see sort of what parts are which. And then also those, when you're thinking about them from a functional perspective or tactical perspective, it's like, okay, I get the developers going through this, discover to scale stage. What do I need? And there's key, what we wanted to do was make sure that we were using a lot of language that's especially used corporately, because I think for a lot of technical people or, sort of young evangelists coming into the space, they're not using those terms, and then it gets even much harder to sell and to talk about it at that larger corporate scale. So key own touch points. What's the content that you're developing that you own, to those key external ones where you're interacting with other partners, or the Stack Overflow pieces that you do. you know, a lot of the other pieces that you do. So we wanted to make sure that it was sort of an explainable framework, but a usable framework as well. So it's actually something that we use quite often with customers and our clients, and works really well. So would love some feedback on this one if you get a chance to take a look at that.
I mean, in terms of where we're up to, we've done about 35,000 words. But really, you know, before we go too much further, as I said, we really want, you know, this to be a collaborative process. It isn't our book, you know, it's really to try and help the community move forward as a whole. So this is actually the first time we've actually spoken publicly about the book. And Caroline's kind of been writing it for over a year. So it's actually quite a big day, I guess, for Caroline. I'm relatively new to it still. Yeah, we've got progress. We've been pitching it to publishers, and we've got some interest, which is great. Who knows though? We'll see how those things kind of go. Yeah, that's kind of, I guess, everything I've got to say. I don't know, Caroline, if you want to kind of.
No, just really looking for feedback, and it might maybe even at this point, or you know, at some point, be helpful to share maybe our outline so you can see what pieces we are talking about, and maybe there might be something else you might want to suggest we add to it, or it's like, yeah, make sure you spend more time on this part as opposed to this part. I think would be. Yeah,
we could maybe throw the outline up on the book website or something so people can take a look at it, and we can put the image in there too.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So yeah, sort of open to suggestions, and I think especially along the images that we showed, or you know, so again, some of those key frameworks that underpin what we do. And then we've got some around segmentation and metrics as well.